Sarah Mitchell sat in the back of the police car, her hands cuffed behind her back, staring out the window at the familiar streets of downtown Washington, D.C. The metal restraints dug into her wrists as the vehicle bumped over a pothole. She had been in this exact situation before, but never like this. Never when she was completely innocent. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. Sarah woke up at 5:30 a.m. in her small apartment near DuPont Circle, made her usual black coffee, and checked her secure phone for any overnight messages. As a government contractor specializing in cybersecurity, she was used to early morning calls and urgent situations. Her job required her to be available around the clock, ready to respond to any digital threats against critical infrastructure. At exactly 7:15 a.m., Sarah walked into the lobby of the federal building where she worked. She had been making this same journey for 3 years, ever since she graduated from Georgetown University with a master's degree in computer science. The security guard, Marcus, always greeted her with a warm smile and a joke about the weather. Today was no different. "Morning, Miss Sarah." "Looks like we're getting some rain later," Marcus said, barely looking up from his newspaper as she swiped her badge. "Good morning, Marcus." "At least it'll cool things down a bit," she replied, heading toward the elevators. Sarah's office was on the 15th floor, in a section of the building that required additional security clearance. She worked for a small but important division that monitored cyber threats against government systems. Her team of 12 specialists worked quietly, often unnoticed by the public, but their work was crucial to national security. The elevator dinged softly as it reached her floor. Sarah stepped out and walked down the long hallway lined with unmarked doors. Her badge beeped as she entered the secure area, and she settled into her cubicle, surrounded by multiple computer monitors and stacks of technical manuals. Her supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, stopped by around 9 a.m. with an unusual request. Dr. Walsh was a woman in her early 50s who had worked in government cybersecurity for over 20 years. She had recruited Sarah directly from university, impressed by her innovative approach to threat detection. "Sarah, I need you to take a look at something," Dr. Walsh said, her voice lower than usual. "We've detected some unusual activity on one of our secure networks. The patterns don't match anything we've seen before." Sarah nodded, already pulling up the relevant systems on her computer. "What kind of activity are we talking about?" "Data transfers that shouldn't be happening. Someone appears to be accessing classified information without proper authorization. The timestamps show the activity has been ongoing for about 2 weeks." This was the kind of challenge Sarah lived for. She spent the next 4 hours diving deep into network logs, tracing digital footprints, and analyzing data patterns. What she found was disturbing. Someone with high-level access had been systematically copying sensitive documents related to military communications systems. As she worked, Sarah noticed something odd. The unauthorized access was happening during times when she was logged into the system. In fact, according to the logs, her user credentials were being used to access the classified information. Her heart started racing as she realized the implications. "Dr. Walsh," Sarah called out, her voice tight with concern. "I think you need to see this." Dr. Walsh hurried over to Sarah's desk, leaning down to look at the computer screen. Sarah pointed to the access logs, showing her own username associated with the unauthorized data transfers. "This shows my credentials accessing these files, but I never open any of these documents," Sarah explained. "Someone has been using my identity to steal classified information." Dr. Walsh's expression grew grave. "We need to report this immediately. This could be a serious breach." Within an hour, Sarah found herself sitting in a conference room with 3 people she had never seen before. They introduced themselves as investigators from the Department of Homeland Security. The lead investigator, Agent Robert Chen, was a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. "Miss Mitchell," Agent Chen began, "we understand there may have been unauthorized access to classified systems using your credentials." Sarah nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Yes, sir. I discovered it this morning while investigating unusual network activity. Someone has been using my username to access files I've never opened. Can you walk us through your typical day? Who has access to your computer? Do you share passwords with anyone? Sarah answered each question thoroughly, explaining her security protocols and daily routines. She emphasized that she always followed proper procedures for handling classified information and had never shared her credentials with anyone. The questioning continued for 2 hours. The investigators asked about her personal life, her finances, her relationships, and her political views. Sarah answered everything honestly, but she could sense their growing suspicion. Despite her cooperation, they seemed to doubt her story. "Miss Mitchell," Agent Chen said finally, "we're going to need to search your workspace and your personal devices. We're also placing you on administrative leave pending the outcome of our investigation." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Administrative leave? But I'm the one who reported this. I'm the victim here. "We understand your position," Agent Chen replied, "but we have to follow protocol. Someone with your level of access committing espionage is a serious matter." The word espionage hit Sarah like a physical blow. They actually suspected her of being a spy. She watched in shock as the investigators began bagging her computer, her notebooks, and even her personal phone. As she was escorted out of the building, Sarah noticed her co-workers staring at her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Word had already begun to spread that she was under investigation for stealing classified information. She could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they whispered to each other as she passed. The next morning, Sarah woke to find 2 black SUVs parked outside her apartment building. Through her window, she could see men in dark suits sitting inside the vehicles, watching her building. Her phone had been returned to her the previous evening, but she noticed it was running slowly and the battery was draining faster than usual. She suspected it was being monitored. Sarah tried to maintain some normalcy, going to the grocery store and running errands as she normally would. But everywhere she went, she felt like she was being watched. The men in suits followed her at a distance, never approaching but always present. Her friends and family began treating her differently too. Her mother called, crying, asking if the news reports about a government contractor under investigation for espionage were about her daughter. Sarah's younger brother stopped returning her calls altogether. The isolation was devastating. Sarah had always prided herself on her integrity and her service to her country. Now she was being treated like a traitor, and there seemed to be nothing she could do to prove her innocence. 3 days after the investigation began, Sarah decided to hire a lawyer. She contacted Margaret Foster, a defense attorney who specialized in cases involving government employees and security clearances. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 40s who had successfully defended several high-profile cases. "Sarah," Margaret said during their first meeting, "the evidence against you is circumstantial, but it's serious. Your credentials were used to access classified information, and you had the technical knowledge to cover your tracks." "But I didn't do it," Sarah insisted. "Someone else is using my identity." "Can't they see that?" "The problem is proving it," Margaret replied. "In cases like this, the government tends to assume guilt until innocence is proven beyond doubt. We need to find evidence that someone else had access to your credentials." Sarah spent the next week working with Margaret to build her defense. They requested access to additional security footage, network logs, and personnel records. But every piece of evidence seemed to point back to Sarah's involvement. The breakthrough came when Sarah remembered something odd from a few weeks earlier. She had received an email that appeared to be from the IT department, asking her to update her password due to a security upgrade. She had followed the instructions without thinking twice about it, as such requests were common in her high-security environment. "Margaret, what if someone used a phishing email to steal my credentials?" Sarah suggested during one of their meetings. Margaret's eyes lit up. "That's exactly the kind of thing we need to investigate. Do you still have the email?" Sarah pulled up her email archive and found the message. Margaret immediately noticed something suspicious about the sender's address. It appeared to come from the IT department, but the domain was slightly different from the official government domain. "This is it," Margaret said excitedly. "This is how someone got your credentials."
We need to trace this email and find out who sent it.
But, even with this potential lead, the investigation against Sarah continued to escalate. The media had picked up the story, reporting that a government contractor with high-level security clearance was suspected of selling classified information to foreign agents. Sarah's name wasn't mentioned publicly, but everyone in her professional circle knew it was her. The psychological pressure was enormous. Sarah barely slept, constantly worried about her future and her reputation. She had dedicated her career to protecting her country's digital infrastructure, and now she was accused of betraying everything she believed in.
2 weeks into the investigation, things took a turn for the worse.
Agent Chen called Margaret to inform them that they had found additional evidence suggesting Sarah had been in contact with foreign intelligence operatives. Apparently, her personal phone records showed calls to numbers associated with suspected spies.
Sarah was devastated. "Margaret, I've never called any foreign agents. I don't even know any foreign agents. Someone is setting me up."
"We'll fight this," Margaret assured her. "But, we need to be prepared for the possibility that you might be arrested."
The next morning, Sarah's worst fears came true.
She was getting ready for another meeting with Margaret when she heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment.
Through the peephole, she could see Agent Chen and several other law enforcement officers. The knock on her door was firm and authoritative. "Miss Mitchell, this is Agent Chen with the Department of Homeland Security. We have a warrant for your arrest." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the door. Agent Chen read her rights while another officer placed handcuffs on her wrists.
The metal was cold against her skin, and she could feel her neighbors watching from their doorways as she was led out of the building. "Agent Chen," Sarah said as they walked toward the police car, "I want you to know that I am innocent. I have never betrayed my country, and I never would."
Agent Chen's expression was unreadable. "Miss Mitchell, that's for a court to decide."
As Sarah sat in the back of the police car, watching her apartment building disappear behind them, she wondered if her life would ever return to normal. She was facing charges that could result in decades in prison, and the evidence against her seemed to be growing stronger every day. But Sarah refused to give up hope. Somewhere out there was the real spy, the person who had stolen her identity and used it to betray her country. She was determined to find them and clear her name, no matter how long it took or what it cost her. The holding cell at the Federal Detention Center was smaller than Sarah's bathroom. Gray concrete walls surrounded a narrow metal bench and a toilet that barely qualified as functional. The fluorescent light overhead flickered constantly, creating an unsettling strobe effect that made it difficult to think clearly. Sarah had been in custody for 18 hours, and sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Agent Chen's face reading her the charges: conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Each charge carried a potential sentence of 10 to 20 years in federal prison.
The intake process had been humiliating.
Sarah was fingerprinted, photographed, and strip-searched by female guards who treated her with professional detachment. Her personal belongings were cataloged and stored, including the small silver necklace her grandmother had given her for graduation. She was issued an orange jumpsuit that was too large and canvas shoes that had no laces. Around noon, a guard informed her that her lawyer had arrived. Sarah was led through a series of locked doors and metal detectors to a small conference room where Margaret Foster was waiting with a thick stack of legal documents.
"Sarah, how are you holding up?"
Margaret asked, her voice filled with concern. "I've been better," Sarah replied, sitting down across from her lawyer.
"What's happening with my case?"
Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out several folders. "The government is pushing for no bail, claiming you're a flight risk and a danger to national security. They're arguing that someone with your technical skills and alleged foreign contacts could easily disappear or continue to leak classified information." Sarah felt her heart sink.
"So I might not get out until trial?"
"We're going to fight it," Margaret assured her. "But, I have to be honest, the evidence they've presented is more extensive than I initially thought. They claim to have recorded phone conversations between you and foreign agents, financial records showing suspicious deposits, and computer evidence that you actively tried to cover your tracks."
None of that is true, Sarah said firmly.
I've never spoken to foreign agents, I haven't received any suspicious payments, and I reported the security breach myself.
Someone is framing me, Margaret.
I believe you, Margaret replied, but we need to prove it. And, right now, the evidence is stacked against us. Margaret explained that the prosecution was being led by Assistant United States Attorney David Morrison, a prosecutor known for his aggressive approach to national security cases. Morrison had built his career on high-profile espionage convictions and rarely lost a case. Morrison is claiming that you were recruited by foreign intelligence several years ago and have been feeding them information ever since, Margaret continued. According to their theory, you used your position to gain access to increasingly sensitive information, and, when you realized you were being investigated, you tried to frame someone else.
Sarah shook her head in disbelief. That's completely backwards.
I discovered the breach and reported it.
Why would I do that if I was the spy?
Their theory is that you knew you were about to be caught and tried to create a cover story, Margaret explained. They're saying the phishing email you received was actually sent by you to yourself to create false evidence.
The complexity of the frame-up was staggering.
Whoever was behind this had planned extensively, creating multiple layers of false evidence that painted Sarah as a sophisticated spy. The more she learned about the case against her, the more impressed and terrified she became of her unknown enemy's capabilities.
The bail hearing was scheduled for the next morning.
Margaret spent the rest of their meeting preparing Sarah for what to expect in court. Federal judges in national security cases were notoriously cautious about releasing defendants, especially those with access to classified information. That night, Sarah lay on the thin mattress in her cell, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together how this had happened to her. She thought about her co-workers, wondering if any of them could be involved. Who else had access to her workspace? Who could have observed her entering passwords or had opportunities to install malicious software on her computer?
The next morning, Sarah was transported to the federal courthouse in shackles.
The courtroom was packed with journalists, government officials, and curious onlookers. She could see her parents sitting in the gallery, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Judge Patricia Williams was a stern woman in her 60s who had presided over numerous high-profile terrorism and espionage cases. She listened carefully as both sides presented their arguments about bail.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison painted Sarah as a dangerous traitor who had sold out her country for money.
He presented evidence of the alleged phone calls to foreign agents, claiming the recordings proved Sarah had been planning to flee the country. Your Honor, Morrison argued, the defendant has demonstrated both the means and the motive to continue her criminal activity. She possesses extensive knowledge of classified systems and has already shown her willingness to betray her oath of service. No amount of bail or supervision can guarantee the safety of our national security if she is released. Margaret countered with character witnesses and evidence of Sarah's dedication to her country. She brought forward Dr. Walsh, who testified about Sarah's exemplary work record and her voluntary reporting of the security breach. Your Honor, Margaret argued, my client is the victim of an elaborate frame-up. She discovered illegal activity and reported it to her supervisors. The idea that she would steal classified information and then report her own crime makes no sense. Judge Williams deliberated for nearly an hour before returning to the bench. Given the serious nature of these charges and the government's evidence regarding flight risk, I am denying bail.
The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial.
Sarah felt her legs give out as the judge's words hit her. Margaret steadied her as the bailiff approached with handcuffs. As she was led out of the courtroom, Sarah caught a glimpse of her parents' devastated faces. Back at the detention center, Sarah was assigned to a cell block with other federal prisoners awaiting trial. Her cellmate was Maria Santos, a woman in her 30s who was facing drug trafficking charges. Maria had been in custody for 8 months and had become something of a veteran at navigating the federal system.
First time? Maria asked as Sarah unpacked her few belongings.
Yeah, Sarah replied.
I'm hoping it's also the last time.
What are you in for? Maria asked with the casual tone of someone accustomed to discussing criminal charges.
Espionage, Sarah said quietly. Maria's eyebrows shot up. Damn, girl. That's serious. How long are you looking at? Could be life if I'm convicted, Sarah answered.
Over the following days, Maria became an unexpected source of support and guidance. She taught Sarah how to navigate the complex social dynamics of the detention center, how to stay safe, and how to maintain hope during the long wait for trial. The key, Maria explained, is to keep your mind busy. Focus on your case, help your lawyer, stay in shape.
Don't let this place break you down. Sarah threw herself into working on her defense.
Margaret visited twice a week, and, together they began developing strategies to challenge the evidence against her. They requested access to additional computer logs, security footage, and personnel records.
The breakthrough came during Sarah's third week in custody. Margaret arrived for their meeting with unusual excitement in her demeanor.
"Sarah, I think we found something," Margaret said, spreading documents across the conference table.
Remember that phishing email you received?
We've been tracing its origin, and we discovered something interesting. Margaret explained that a cybersecurity expert she had hired found evidence that the phishing email was part of a larger campaign targeting multiple government employees. The same techniques had been used to compromise at least 6 other individuals with security clearances. More importantly, Margaret continued, we found evidence that someone inside your workplace had access to the system that could have facilitated this kind of attack. Someone who knew your work schedule, your access patterns, and your security protocols. This was the first real hope Sarah had felt since her arrest. If they could prove that someone else had the means and opportunity to steal her credentials, it would cast serious doubt on the government's case. But the investigation was far from over. The prosecution continued to build their case, interviewing Sarah's colleagues and examining every aspect of her life. Agent Chen visited the detention center several times, hoping Sarah would confess or provide information about her alleged co-conspirators. "Miss Mitchell," Agent Chen said during one visit, "we know you didn't do this alone. Tell us who recruited you, and we can work out a deal."
Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. "Agent Chen, I didn't do this at all. I'm not going to confess to crimes I didn't commit or implicate innocent people." Agent Chen seemed frustrated by Sarah's continued assertions of innocence. "The evidence against you is overwhelming.
Your only chance is to cooperate with us."
"My only chance is to prove my innocence," Sarah replied firmly.
As the weeks passed, the case began to attract national media attention. News outlets reported on the government spy who had allegedly sold military secrets to foreign powers. Sarah's photograph appeared on television and, in newspapers, always accompanied by the word accused, but creating the impression of guilt in the public mind. The media attention made life in detention even more difficult. Other prisoners recognized Sarah from news reports, and some viewed her as a traitor. She received hate mail from strangers who believed she had betrayed her country. But there was also support from unexpected sources. Several cybersecurity experts contacted Margaret, offering to help with Sarah's defense. They believed the technical evidence against her was suspicious and wanted to conduct their own analysis. One of these experts, Dr. Michael Chang from MIT, discovered something crucial while examining the computer logs. He found evidence that someone had used advanced techniques to mask their true identity while accessing the classified systems. The digital fingerprints left behind were too perfect, too obviously tied to Sarah's credentials. "This is what we call a false flag operation in cybersecurity," Dr. Chang explained to Margaret and Sarah during a conference call. Someone with sophisticated knowledge created evidence designed to frame Sarah. A real spy would have been more careful to hide their tracks. Dr. Chang's analysis provided new ammunition for Sarah's defense, but it also revealed the frightening sophistication of whoever was behind the frame-up. This wasn't the work of an amateur or a disgruntled co-worker. It required advanced technical skills and detailed knowledge of government computer systems. Margaret began investigating Sarah's co-workers more thoroughly, looking for anyone who might have the expertise to carry out such an elaborate deception. The list of suspects was short but troubling. It included several people Sarah had trusted and worked with closely. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to endure the daily challenges of life in federal detention. The food was barely edible, the noise was constant, and the uncertainty about her future was emotionally exhausting. She maintained her innocence to everyone who would listen, but, as the months passed, even some of her supporters began to have doubts. Her relationship with her family became strained. Her father, a retired military officer, struggled to understand how his daughter could be accused of such crimes. Her mother stood by her but was clearly devastated by the situation. Her brother stopped visiting altogether, unable to face the possibility that his sister might be a traitor. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Sarah had gone from being a respected government contractor working on important national security issues to being treated like a dangerous criminal. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that sometimes she wondered if she was losing her mind. But Sarah refused to give up. She spent her time reading legal documents, helping Margaret prepare her defense, and maintaining her physical fitness by doing exercises in her cell. She also began keeping a detailed journal, documenting every aspect of her case and her experiences in detention. 6 months after her arrest, Margaret brought news that would change everything. The cybersecurity investigation had uncovered evidence of a spy ring operating within the federal government. Several employees with high-level security clearances were suspected of selling information to foreign intelligence services. "Sarah," Margaret said with barely contained excitement, "we think we know who framed you. And, more importantly, we think we can prove it." The name that changed everything was James Fletcher. Margaret spread the investigation files across the conference table, her hands trembling slightly with excitement. After 6 months of digging, cross-referencing, and following digital breadcrumbs, they had finally found their smoking gun. "James Fletcher," Margaret said, pointing to a photograph of a man in his early 40s with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "He works in your building, 3 floors down in the IT security department. He has administrative access to the entire network infrastructure." Sarah stared at the photo, trying to remember if she had ever seen this man before. The face was vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place where or when they might have encountered each other. "What makes you think he's involved?" Sarah asked. Margaret opened another folder, revealing financial records and surveillance photographs. Dr. Chang's investigation into the cyber attack revealed that someone with deep system knowledge had been systematically planting evidence to frame you. "We traced the digital signatures back to administrative accounts, which led us to Fletcher. The evidence against Fletcher was extensive and damning. Bank records showed regular deposits of large amounts of cash into accounts under false names. Surveillance footage from various locations around Washington, D.C. showed him meeting with known foreign intelligence operatives. Most importantly, computer forensics revealed that he had accessed Sarah's user account multiple times without authorization." "Fletcher had everything he needed to frame you," Margaret explained. "He knew your work patterns, your access schedules, and your security protocols. He could observe when you logged in and out, and he had the technical skills to make it appear that your credentials were being used for unauthorized access." Dr. Chang had discovered that Fletcher had been operating a sophisticated spy ring for nearly 2 years. He recruited other government employees by identifying those with financial problems or personal issues that made them vulnerable to blackmail. Once recruited, these individuals provided Fletcher with access to classified information from their respective departments. "The phishing email you received was Fletcher's doing," Margaret continued. "He sent similar emails to dozens of government employees, hoping to harvest their credentials. Most people didn't fall for it, but you and a few others did. Fletcher used those stolen credentials to access classified systems while making it appear that the legitimate users were responsible." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that her innocence was finally being proven, and anger that Fletcher had destroyed her life to cover his own crimes. But she also felt frustrated that it had taken 6 months to uncover this information. "Why didn't the government find this evidence earlier?" Sarah asked. "They have more resources than we do." Margaret's expression darkened. "That's a good question, and it raises some troubling possibilities. Either they were incompetent in their investigation, or what? Or someone didn't want Fletcher to be caught," Margaret finished. "Someone who benefited from having you take the blame."
This possibility opened up even more disturbing questions. Was Fletcher working alone, or was he part of a larger conspiracy that included people in law enforcement or intelligence agencies? Had Sarah been deliberately framed not just to protect Fletcher, but to cover up an even bigger security breach?
Margaret had already contacted the FBI and provided them with the evidence against Fletcher. But the response had been frustratingly slow. Agent Chen claimed they were reviewing the information, but weeks passed without any action being taken.
"They're stalling," Margaret told Sarah during one of their meetings.
"I think there are people in the government who don't want this case reopened." Fletcher's arrest would raise questions about how he was able to operate for so long without being detected. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to languish in federal detention. The evidence of her innocence was compelling, but the legal system moved slowly, especially in cases involving national security.
Every day she remained locked up was another day of her life stolen by Fletcher's crimes.
The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's former supervisor, had been conducting her own investigation into the security breach. She had never believed that Sarah was capable of espionage, and she used her position within the government to dig deeper into the case. Dr. Walsh discovered that Fletcher had been flagged by internal security audits on multiple occasions, but those reports had been buried or ignored. Someone with authority had been protecting Fletcher, allowing him to continue his espionage activities while Sarah took the blame. "Sarah," Margaret said during an emergency visit, "Dr. Walsh has found evidence that this goes all the way to the top of your department. There's been a systematic cover-up to protect Fletcher and his spy ring." Dr. Walsh had uncovered emails and internal memos showing that senior officials knew about Fletcher's suspicious activities months before Sarah was arrested. Rather than investigating Fletcher, they had chosen to focus on other targets, including Sarah when she reported the security breach. The conspiracy was more extensive than anyone had imagined.
Fletcher wasn't just a lone spy selling secrets for money. He was part of a larger operation that had infiltrated multiple government agencies.
Some officials had been compromised through blackmail or bribery, while others were simply incompetent and preferred to blame lower-level employees rather than acknowledge their own failures. With Dr. Walsh's evidence, Margaret was able to file a motion for Sarah's immediate release. The motion included detailed documentation of the government's misconduct and the evidence of Fletcher's guilt.
It also raised serious questions about whether Sarah had been deliberately framed as part of a larger cover-up.
Federal Judge Patricia Williams, the same judge who had denied Sarah's bail 6 months earlier, scheduled an emergency hearing to review the new evidence. The hearing was closed to the public due to the classified nature of the information being discussed. Sarah was transported to the courthouse in shackles, just as she had been for every previous appearance. But, this time, Margaret's confidence gave her hope that things might finally change.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison looked uncomfortable as he entered the courtroom.
He had built his reputation on winning national security cases, but now he was facing the possibility that his star prosecution was based on fabricated evidence.
"Your Honor," Margaret began, "we have uncovered extensive evidence that my client is innocent and has been the victim of an elaborate frame-up. We request that all charges against Miss Mitchell be dropped immediately."
Margaret presented Dr. Chang's cybersecurity analysis, Dr. Walsh's internal investigation, and the financial evidence linking Fletcher to foreign intelligence services.
The case against Fletcher was so strong that even Morrison seemed convinced of Sarah's innocence.
"Your Honor," Morrison said reluctantly, "in light of this new evidence, the government requests a recess to review our case against Miss Mitchell." Judge Williams was clearly frustrated by the government's handling of the case. "Mr. Morrison, you've had my courtroom tied up for 6 months with what now appears to be a fundamentally flawed prosecution.
How do you explain the failure to investigate Mr. Fletcher earlier?"
Morrison had no good answer. The truth was that the government had been so convinced of Sarah's guilt that they had stopped looking for other suspects.
When evidence pointing to Fletcher surfaced, some officials had chosen to suppress it rather than admit their mistakes.
After a 2-hour recess, Morrison returned to the courtroom with a prepared statement. "Your Honor, after reviewing the new evidence, the government is dropping all charges against Miss Sarah Mitchell. We will be pursuing charges against James Fletcher and others involved in this espionage conspiracy."
Sarah felt her knees buckle as the words sank in.
After 6 months in federal detention, facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison, she was finally free. Margaret grabbed her arm to steady her as tears streamed down her face. But the victory was bittersweet. Judge Williams ordered Sarah's immediate release, but she also made it clear that the government's handling of the case had been unacceptable. "Miss Mitchell," Judge Williams said, "you have suffered a grave injustice.
The system that was supposed to protect you instead betrayed you.
I hope you will consider seeking appropriate remedies for the harm you have endured."
Sarah was processed out of the detention center that same afternoon.
She signed papers, collected her personal belongings, and walked out into the sunshine for the first time in 6 months. Margaret was waiting outside with Sarah's parents, who had driven down from Philadelphia when they heard the news. The reunion with her family was emotional and overwhelming. Her mother cried uncontrollably, while her father apologized repeatedly for ever doubting her innocence. Even her brother was there, shamefaced and seeking forgiveness for abandoning her during the darkest period of her life.
"Sarah, I'm so sorry," her brother said, tears in his eyes.
"I should have supported you. I should have known you would never betray your country."
"It's okay," Sarah replied, though the hurt was still fresh. "This whole experience has been surreal for everyone."
The media was already reporting the dramatic reversal in Sarah's case. Headlines described her as a government scapegoat and questioned how such a massive error in justice could have occurred.
But Sarah wasn't ready to deal with media attention.
She just wanted to go home and try to rebuild her life. Margaret drove Sarah back to her apartment, which had been maintained by her parents during her imprisonment. Everything was exactly as she had left it, but it felt strange and unfamiliar after 6 months away.
"What happens now?" Sarah asked as she looked around her living room.
"Now we focus on getting your life back," Margaret replied. "Your security clearance has been restored, and your former employer wants you back. But I also think you should consider filing a civil lawsuit against the government for what they put you through." The idea of more legal proceedings was exhausting to consider, but Margaret was right that Sarah deserved compensation for the injustice she had suffered. Her reputation had been destroyed, her career had been derailed, and her family relationships had been damaged.
The financial and emotional costs of her wrongful prosecution were enormous.
Over the following days, more details about Fletcher's spy ring emerged. He had been arrested at his home and was cooperating with investigators in hopes of reducing his sentence. His network had included 12 other government employees who had been selling classified information for nearly 3 years. The scope of the security breach was staggering. Fletcher's ring had compromised military communication systems, diplomatic cables, and intelligence assessments. The damage to national security was far worse than anyone had initially realized. Even more troubling was the revelation that several high-ranking officials had known about Fletcher's activities but had chosen to cover them up rather than address the security vulnerabilities he had exposed. These officials were now facing their own criminal investigations. Sarah followed the news coverage with fascination and horror. She realized how close she had come to spending the rest of her life in prison for crimes committed by the very person who had framed her. The injustice of it was almost too much to comprehend. But she also felt a sense of vindication. Her decision to report the security breach, despite the personal cost, had ultimately led to the exposure of a major espionage ring. If she had remained silent, Fletcher and his accomplices might have continued selling secrets for years.
3 weeks after her release, Sarah received an unexpected visitor.
Agent Chen appeared at her door, looking uncomfortable and holding an official-looking document. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry for the way you were treated." Agent Chen explained that the FBI's internal investigation had revealed serious failures in the handling of Sarah's case. Several agents and prosecutors were facing disciplinary action for their roles in the wrongful prosecution.
"We'd like you to consider returning to government service," Agent Chen continued.
"Your country needs people with your skills and integrity." Sarah looked at the man who had arrested her, who had treated her like a traitor, who had refused to believe her protestations of innocence. The irony of him now asking her to return to work for the same government that had destroyed her life was not lost on her.
Agent Chen, Sarah said calmly, I need time to think about my future. Right now, I'm focused on rebuilding my life and holding people accountable for what happened to me.
As Agent Chen left, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in less than a year. She had gone from being a dedicated government contractor to a federal prisoner to a vindicated victim of prosecutorial misconduct. The experience had changed her in ways she was still discovering. But one thing was clear, she was no longer the naive young woman who had trusted the system to protect her. She had learned hard lessons about justice, corruption, and the importance of fighting for truth even when the odds seemed impossible. 6 months after her release, Sarah stood before a packed congressional hearing room, her right hand raised as she swore to tell the truth about one of the most significant intelligence failures in recent government history. The House Committee on Oversight and Reform had called her to testify about the systemic failures that led to her wrongful prosecution and the near collapse of critical national security operations. Committee Chairman Robert Hayes, a stern man from Texas with silver hair and deep-set eyes, leaned into his microphone.
Miss Mitchell, thank you for your willingness to testify today.
Your experience represents a catastrophic failure of our justice system, and the American people deserve to know how this happened. Sarah looked out at the sea of faces in the hearing room. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras focused on her every movement. Government officials sat in the front rows, many of them looking uncomfortable as they waited for details about their failures to be aired publicly.
In the months since her release, Sarah had become something of a reluctant celebrity.
Her story of wrongful imprisonment and vindication had captured national attention, particularly among civil liberties advocates and government reform groups. She had received dozens of interview requests, book offers, and speaking invitations, most of which she had declined. Instead, Sarah had focused on working with Margaret Foster to pursue a comprehensive civil lawsuit against the federal government. The case was unprecedented in its scope, seeking damages not just for Sarah's wrongful imprisonment but for the systematic failures that allowed James Fletcher's spy ring to operate undetected for years. Chairman Hayes, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I want to start by saying that I never sought to become the face of government accountability. I was simply a cybersecurity professional trying to do my job and serve my country. What happened to me could happen to any government employee who discovers wrongdoing and tries to report it through proper channels. Sarah's testimony detailed the chronology of events from the moment she discovered the security breach to her eventual vindication. But, more importantly, she outlined the systemic problems that had enabled her persecution and Fletcher's crimes. The first failure, Sarah explained, was the rush to judgment. When I reported unauthorized access to classified systems, investigators immediately assumed that I was the perpetrator rather than the victim. They ignored evidence that contradicted their theory and failed to conduct a thorough investigation of other possible suspects. Congressman David Park from California, a former prosecutor himself, leaned forward with interest.
Miss Mitchell, in your opinion, why were investigators so quick to focus on you rather than looking for other suspects? Sarah had thought about this question extensively.
Congressman Park, I believe it was a combination of cognitive bias and institutional pressure. Once they developed a theory that I was the spy, every piece of evidence was interpreted to support that theory. Additionally, there was pressure to solve a high-profile case quickly, which discouraged thorough investigation. What Sarah didn't say, but what had become clear through Margaret's investigation, was that there were also deeper institutional problems at play. Several high-ranking officials had known about Fletcher's suspicious activities but had chosen to ignore them, either through incompetence or corruption.
The hearing continued for 3 hours, with Sarah answering detailed questions about every aspect of her ordeal.
She described the psychological torture of being treated like a traitor, the strain on her family relationships, and the devastating impact on her career and reputation. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came when Sarah detailed how Fletcher's spy ring had been able to operate undetected for years. Internal audits had flagged his suspicious activities multiple times, but those reports had been buried or ignored by senior officials. The security breach I discovered was not an isolated incident, Sarah testified. Mr. Fletcher and his accomplices had been systematically stealing classified information for nearly 3 years. The damage to our national security is still being assessed, but it includes compromised military operations, blown intelligence assets, and diplomatic disasters. Congresswoman Maria Rodriguez from Florida asked the question that everyone was thinking, Ms. Mitchell, how many American lives may have been lost because of the government's failure to properly investigate this spy ring? Sarah paused, feeling the weight of the question. Congresswoman Rodriguez, that information is still classified, but I can say that the consequences of this security breach extend far beyond what was initially reported to the public. After the hearing, Sarah was surrounded by reporters shouting questions and requesting interviews. Margaret helped her navigate through the crowd to a waiting car, where they drove to a quiet restaurant for lunch. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked as they settled into a private booth. "Drained," Sarah admitted. "But also hopeful that maybe something good will come from all this." The congressional hearing was just one part of Sarah's broader campaign for justice and accountability. The civil lawsuit against the government was progressing slowly but steadily. Margaret had assembled a team of attorneys and expert witnesses who were documenting every aspect of the government's misconduct. The case was complicated by the classified nature of much of the evidence, but they had been granted special security clearances to review relevant documents. What they found was a pattern of negligence and cover-ups that went far beyond Sarah's individual case. Sarah, Margaret explained during one of their strategy sessions, this isn't just about compensation for what happened to you. This case could force fundamental reforms in how the government handles national security investigations. Meanwhile, James Fletcher's trial was proceeding in federal court. He had pleaded guilty to multiple charges of espionage and was cooperating with investigators in hopes of reducing his sentence. His cooperation had led to the arrest of 12 other members of his spy ring, including several high-ranking government officials. Sarah attended some of Fletcher's court hearings, wanting to see the man who had destroyed her life face justice. Fletcher was a small, unremarkable man who looked like any number of middle-aged government bureaucrats. It was hard to believe that someone so ordinary had been responsible for such extraordinary damage. During his sentencing hearing, Fletcher was given an opportunity to address the court. He turned to look at Sarah, who was sitting in the gallery. "Miss Mitchell," Fletcher said, his voice barely audible, "I know that nothing I can say will undo the harm I caused you. You were an innocent victim of my crimes, and I'm sorry for what I put you through." Sarah felt no satisfaction from his apology. Fletcher's remorse seemed genuine, but it couldn't restore the 6 months of her life he had stolen or repair the damage to her relationships and career. Judge Williams, the same judge who had presided over Sarah's case, sentenced Fletcher to 35 years in federal prison. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "your crimes didn't just betray your country. You also destroyed the life of an innocent woman who was trying to protect the very systems you were attacking." Following Fletcher's sentencing, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She accepted a position with a private cybersecurity firm that specialized in protecting government contractors and critical infrastructure. "Why go back to this kind of work?" her brother asked during a family dinner. "After everything that happened, why not try something completely different?" Sarah had thought about this question extensively. "Because this is what I'm good at," she replied. "And because the problems that allowed Fletcher's spy ring to exist are still out there. Someone needs to work on fixing them." Sarah's new position gave her the opportunity to work on cybersecurity issues without being directly employed by the government. She could use her expertise and hard-won knowledge of system vulnerabilities to help protect sensitive information while maintaining her independence. Her first major assignment was conducting a security audit for a defense contractor that had been targeted by foreign hackers. Sarah's reputation as someone who had uncovered a major spy ring made her a valuable consultant for organizations worried about insider threats. The work was challenging and rewarding, but Sarah found herself approaching security issues with a level of paranoia and skepticism that hadn't existed before her ordeal. She trusted no one completely and questioned every anomaly, no matter how small. "You've changed," Dr. Walsh observed during a lunch meeting 6 months after Sarah started her new job. Dr. Walsh had left government service as well, unable to stomach the bureaucratic failures that had enabled Fletcher's crimes. "Of course I've changed," Sarah replied.
I've learned that the people who are supposed to protect us can be the same people who destroy us. That changes your perspective on everything." Dr. Walsh nodded understandingly. "But you haven't let it make you cynical. You're still fighting to improve the system." This was true. Despite her trauma, Sarah remained committed to making government cybersecurity more effective and accountable. She had become a frequent speaker at security conferences, sharing her experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper threat assessment and investigation procedures. Sarah also worked with Margaret to establish a legal defense fund for government employees who found themselves in similar situations. They had seen too many cases of whistleblowers and conscientious employees being prosecuted for trying to do the right thing. "The system is designed to protect itself, not the people who work within it," Sarah explained during a speech to a group of government contractors. "That has to change, and change starts with people like us refusing to accept injustice." 2 years after her release from prison, Sarah received news that vindicated her decision to fight for accountability. The Department of Justice announced sweeping reforms to how national security investigations would be conducted in the future. The reforms included mandatory review procedures for cases involving government employees, requirements for considering alternative suspects before making arrests, and whistleblower protections for those who report security breaches. "These reforms wouldn't have happened without your courage," Margaret told Sarah as they reviewed the announcement. "Your willingness to fight back made this possible." Sarah's civil lawsuit was finally settled after 3 years of litigation. The government agreed to pay her $15 million in damages and implemented additional reforms to prevent similar injustices. More importantly, several officials involved in covering up Fletcher's activities were fired or forced to resign. But perhaps the most significant victory came when Congress passed the Government Employee Protection Act, legislation directly inspired by Sarah's case. The law established new safeguards for government workers who report security violations and created independent oversight mechanisms for national security investigations. At the bill signing ceremony, President Thompson thanked Sarah personally for her role in exposing the flaws in the system. "Miss Mitchell," the president said, "your courage in the face of injustice has made our country more secure and our government more accountable." Standing in the Oval Office, surrounded by lawmakers and advocates who had supported her cause, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had never intended to become a symbol of government accountability or a catalyst for reform. But sometimes, she realized, the most important battles are the ones you never plan to fight. Her decision to report the security breach, despite the personal cost, had ultimately led to the exposure of a major spy ring and significant improvements in government cybersecurity practices. As she left the White House that day, Sarah felt a sense of closure that had been missing since her ordeal began. She had not only cleared her name and received justice for her wrongful prosecution, but she had also helped create a better system for protecting both national security and the rights of government employees. The young woman who had walked into that federal building 4 years earlier was gone, replaced by someone harder and wiser but no less committed to serving her country. Sarah Mitchell had learned that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is holding your own government accountable, even when the cost is almost too high to bear. Years later, when cybersecurity students study the Fletcher spy ring case, they learn about more than just technical security failures. They learn about the importance of institutional integrity, the courage required to speak truth to power, and the ongoing struggle to balance national security with individual rights. And they learn about Sarah Mitchell, the woman who was treated like a criminal until she proved that sometimes the real criminals are the ones wearing badges and making accusations. Her story serves as both a warning about the dangers of unchecked government power and an inspiration for those who refuse to accept injustice, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. Sarah continues her work in cybersecurity, protecting the systems and institutions that once betrayed her. She has found peace in the knowledge that her suffering was not meaningless, that it led to changes that will protect others from similar injustices. In the end, her story is not just about one woman's fight for vindication, but about the ongoing struggle to create a government worthy of the people it serves. It's a reminder that justice is not guaranteed, but must be fought for by ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things in the face of overwhelming odds.